What if the thing that makes you unbeatable is also the thing slowly breaking your body? Because that's exactly the line this guy seems to live on. He doesn't talk about pain like a warning sign, he talks about it like a career investment. And once you hear how far that mindset goes, you start wondering whether this is elite discipline, pure madness, or the same thing wearing two different names. Let's get into it. Wait, his arms literally do not straighten anymore? That is such a wild sentence to say casually. Like, sorry bro, my elbow's retired. And the insane part is he treats it like a trade-off. Most people would call that a disaster, not a career cost. Arm wrestling might be the only sport where that sounds normal. I keep thinking, how much pain can one sport ask for? Because this is not sore after leg day pain, this is structural damage. Bone growth, scar tissue, nerve issues, blood flow issues, that is brutal. And he just says it like, yeah, that happened. That confidence is either genius or complete madness. Probably both, honestly. What got me is he wanted elbows like the old champion. Who wishes for broken range of motion as a kid? That is some elite freak mindset. But that is how high-level competitors think, apparently. They see a limitation and think it might become an edge. Regular people see an injury and call the doctor. Athletes see it and call it adaptation. Though I do wonder where discipline ends and denial begins. Because he definitely admitted he kept going when he should have rested. That part felt painfully real. Like every great athlete says that, but this one sounds physically expensive. 3 surgeries just to get the elbow moving again is intense. 3! And not cosmetic stuff, actual bone and scar tissue removal. That is one of those sentences that should scare people away from the sport. Instead, it probably makes the real competitors feel seen. Like finally somebody understands our nonsense. But I get why he says it is worth it. If your identity is fully inside the sport, pain becomes part of the bill. Still, weaponized arthritis is such a wild phrase. It sounds like a supervillain diagnosis. Marvel would absolutely buy that pitch. And he was saying the limited range can actually help in some positions. That's the weird beauty of niche sports, right? A disadvantage in one context becomes leverage in another. So your broken elbow might make your arm bar harder to finish, or easier to survive, which is even crazier. Imagine training your body into a bad shape on purpose. That is the most athlete thing ever. But the blood flow and nerve part is where I got serious. Because once nerves get compressed, this is not just soreness anymore. That is function, sensation, actual quality of life. And he still sounds almost casual about it. Athletes really normalize suffering like it is weather. Yeah, today's forecast. Joint degradation with a chance of surgery. I also liked how he framed it as style and genetics, not just brute force. That matters, because people think it is only about being insanely strong. But positioning, leverage, and hand control are the real hidden game. The grip work part is underrated too. Your hand is basically the steering wheel of the whole match. Not the bicep, not the chest, the hand. All that chaos, and it starts with the fingers. Tiny hands, gigantic consequences. That should be the tagline for the sport. And the fact that he kept training through all of it is insane. But that is also why the best stay the best for so long. Or why they cannot stop even when they should. Yeah, that is the darker read. Elite sports reward the exact stubbornness that destroys bodies. That is such a crazy system when you say it out loud. The guy who can tolerate the most damage wins the trophy. That sounds less like athletics and more like a bad survival show. But maybe that is why people love these stories. They are not just about winning, they are about what the body can survive. There is something almost tragic about that. Especially when the athlete sounds proud of the damage. Do you think he is proud or just fully accepting it? I think both can be true, which is annoying. Life is rude like that. Some people romanticize pain, but here it is just the receipt. And he still wants to keep competing, which says a lot. The sport must be addictive at a level most of us cannot understand. Because if the body is falling apart and you still go back, that is deeper than habit. That is probably identity with a grip strength problem. That is a terrible but accurate line. I also love the little detail about the old champion with bent elbows. That is such a lineage thing, like seeing the future of your own body. And then he basically hoped for the same thing. That is sick in the head, respectfully. Respectfully insane is the correct term. But honestly, that mindset is probably what separates champions from talented people. Not just talent, but willingness to absorb the cost. And the cost is way higher than fans ever think about. Fans see matches, medals, hype, and maybe a few crazy clips. They do not see the elbows, the surgeries, the nerve pain, or the guy trying to extend his arm like a normal human, just casually discovering he can no longer fold laundry correctly. The chin-up bar thing was funny, though, like the body might be coaxed back. But at a certain point, you are not stretching. You are negotiating with damage. And damage does not always negotiate back. Yeah, that is the part nobody wants to admit. Still, I respect the honesty of it. No fake wellness talk, no pretending it is all clean. Just bone chips and ambition. That is the least glamorous slogan imaginable. And somehow that makes it more compelling. Because the truth is always more interesting than the highlight reel. Especially when the truth has scar tissue in it. Man, this whole sport feels like a love letter to bad decisions. A very strong love letter, apparently. But yeah, I get why the greats talk like that. If you built your whole life around this, pain is just background noise. Until it is not. And that is what makes it kind of heartbreaking. Still, the dedication is undeniable. Extreme, weird, slightly alarming dedication. Which is basically the recipe for every legendary athlete. I think that is why people cannot look away. You are watching somebody pay a price in real time. And somehow make it sound like a business expense. That might be the most athlete sentence ever. Yeah, but it lands because he means it. That sincerity is what sticks with you after. Wait, did he basically call his own damage a competitive advantage? That is such a terrifyingly casual sentence. And the wild part is, he is not even pretending it is healthy. He is like, the elbow is cooked, but the match starts now. That is insane athlete logic, by the way. But I get why that mindset is addictive. If your body is already changing, you start bargaining with it. You stop asking how to be normal and start asking how to be dangerous. Still, calling arthritis a weapon sounds like denial with a cool nickname. A very expensive nickname, too, with surgeries attached. But that is the whole thing with elite competition. People think greatness is pristine, but it is usually patched together. And arm wrestling is especially brutal because the damage is so visible. Your arm literally stops looking like a normal arm. That is one sport where the injury shows up and says hello. Most sports hide the wear better than that. Here, the joint just slowly goes, no, I am not extending today. The elbow files a formal resignation. And somehow the athlete is like, acceptable, continue. What hit me was how early it started for him. Late 20s is still so young for that kind of breakdown. That means the sport is not just demanding years, it is taking decades. And then you hear him say he kept going anyway. That is where I get a little suspicious of the hero narrative. Like, is that discipline? Or is that just bad decision-making in a gold medal jacket? A gold medal jacket is a crazy phrase. But no, seriously, that tension is real. The line between commitment and stubbornness gets very blurry at the top. And in his case, the surgery count tells you the answer was not neat. 3 surgeries is not a random hiccup, that is a lifestyle. 3 surgeries is basically a subscription. That is awful, but yes. What I respect is that he does not romanticize the pain at all. He just treats it like the entry fee. And that is what makes it weirdly believable. The blood flow and nerve stuff is the part that gets scary, though. Because now it is not just soreness, it is your arm being compromised. That is when sport stops sounding like sport and starts sounding like attrition. Exactly, the body becomes the battlefield. And the crazy thing is, he still talks about technique first. That says a lot about elite athletes, honestly. They are not just surviving pain, they are trying to outthink it. Which is why arm wrestling sounds simple to civilians and then turns out to be chess with tendons. Chess with tendons is brutal. The grip work, the angle work, the rising thing he talked about. All of that is basically tiny mechanical advantages stacked on top of each other. And once your range changes, every inch matters even more. Although I do wonder if people overestimate the romance of adaptation. Sometimes adaptation is just the body losing something and the mind dressing it up. That is harsh, but probably true in a lot of cases. Still, there is something remarkable about turning limitation into timing. Like if you cannot open fully, maybe you build everything around that lock. Modern problem solving, but your elbow is the software bug. Bro, stop making it sound like a startup pitch. Yet that is kind of what these athletes do. They optimize the broken thing instead of waiting for perfect. which is probably why regular people either admire them or think they are completely unhinged. Usually both at the same time. And then there is the psychological side nobody wants to say out loud. If you have built your identity around pain tolerance, resting feels like failure. That is a dangerous place to live, because then every warning sign becomes negotiable. You start calling damage commitment, and burnout becomes character. And that is where sports culture can get a little culty, honestly. We reward the person who keeps going, even when stopping might be smarter. Especially when the trophies make the pain look justified. Yeah, the medal can become a pretty expensive alibi. But at the same time, you cannot fake what he has done. The man is still competing at the top after all that wear. That part is absurd in the actual best way. I keep thinking about how specific the body problem is in arm wrestling. It is not just strength, it is leverage, tendon integrity, angles, endurance. So when the elbow loses range, the whole game changes. Your hardware is fading, but the software has to improvise. Why do you keep making this sound like a broken laptop? Because that is what it is, just with worse consequences. And unlike most athletes, he cannot hide in a team system. It is just you, the other hand, and the damage. That isolation probably makes every weakness feel louder. There is nowhere to disappear in that kind of sport. Which may be why the pain story becomes part of the legend. Not because suffering is noble, but because it is inseparable from the craft. I still think people should be careful not to worship the suffering itself. Worship the mastery, not the injuries. Thank you. Finally, a sane sentence. Because if the injury is the goal, that is just tragedy with better branding. But if the goal is mastery, then the injury is the bill. And he sounds fully aware of that bill. That is what makes the whole thing land with people, I think. He is not selling fantasy, he is reporting the cost. And somehow that makes him even more impressive. Yeah, because reality is heavier than hype. Do you think most great athletes are that self-aware? Or do they just sound that way after? Probably a little of both, honestly. In the middle of it, they are probably just obsessed. Later, obsession gets translated into wisdom. Or a documentary with sad music. That too. But I love that he could laugh about it while still taking it seriously. That is usually the sign somebody has actually lived through the thing. They do not need to dramatize it. The facts are dramatic enough. And honestly, that is the real hook of the whole conversation. Not just that he suffered, but that he kept adapting with clear eyes. Clear eyes, destroyed elbows. Terrible slogan, amazing athlete. Yeah, and somehow that is the perfect ending note. Clear eyes, destroyed elbows is insane branding. But that is the part people miss. He is not hiding the damage. He is almost treating it like a trade-off he can measure. Like, yes, I bought elite status, and the receipt was my joint capsules. That is such a darkly funny way to live. But also, that level of acceptance is rare. Most people hear chronic pain and immediately think retirement. He hears it and thinks, how do I compete with it? That is a completely different brain. A very expensive brain, apparently. Seriously, 3 surgeries just to keep his elbows usable. And that is only what we know about publicly. There is probably a whole private universe of tape, ice, and bad mornings. Every champion has that hidden side. Arm wrestling just makes it impossible to pretend the body is fine. Because the sport is literally your skeleton negotiating with somebody else's skeleton. That is the least elegant sport description I have ever heard. It is also the most accurate. And then he says the bone growth can hit nerves and blood flow. That is where it stops sounding like toughness and starts sounding clinical. Like it is not just pain, it is function getting robbed. Exactly, and that is what makes the whole thing sadder. Yet he is still talking about more matches. Of course he is an arm wrestler. The species is basically unresolved. What I love is he does not sell it like martyrdom. He does not say, look how much I sacrificed for glory. He says, this is the job. That is a much stronger answer. And the wild part is he even found a tactical upside. Weaponized arthritis is such a brutal phrase. It sounds like a lawsuit and a nickname at the same time. But biomechanically, it makes sense. If your range starts later, certain defenses kick in differently. Your body is basically building a new equilibrium around damage, which is the most athlete sentence ever. It is kind of brilliant and kind of horrifying. That is elite sport in one sentence. Because you can keep a competitive edge while being structurally wrecked. That is the uncomfortable truth nobody likes to say out loud. We act like greatness is clean, but it is usually compensating for something. Sometimes a lot of somethings. Yeah, sometimes the compensation is the whole story. And then there is the ego part, which he admitted to. The dummy part where you keep going when rest would be smarter. That is every legend's least flattering chapter. Training through stupidity is practically a medal category. But the honest version is, yes, the body punishes repetition. And the elite athlete often treats punishment as feedback, not warning. Which works until it really does not. Then suddenly you have a surgeon in your career graph. A very invasive manager. I keep thinking about that Ottawa doctor saving his career. That is such an overlooked part of sports greatness. The technician behind the curtain. The athlete gets the spotlight, but the repair work keeps the myth alive. Basically, surgeons are the pit crew of suffering. That is horrible, but yes. And then you realize how narrow the margin is between legend and finished. A little more bone growth, a little less blood flow, and it is over. That is terrifyingly delicate for a combat sport. Humanity keeps inventing ways to make elbow pain into entertainment. That is the whole internet in one sentence. But I also respect how technical it is. People think it is just brute strength, and it is not. The grip work, the rising, the hand control, that is the real war. Yeah, because your hand is the steering wheel. If you lose the hand, you are already in trouble. So the sport is basically hand chess with orthopedic consequences. Hand chess with surgery bills is crazy. And the rising things is fascinating because it is so specific. It is not just lifting, it is creating leverage before the other guy does. Tiny angles, huge consequences. That is why the best guys sound like mechanics, not gym bros. Gym bros usually have working elbows too. Fair. And honestly, the pain story makes the technique story better. Because you understand why every micro-adjustment matters. When the body is limited, intelligence becomes louder. That is such a good line. Put that on a poster and sell it to suffering adults. Adults would buy it immediately. But there is also something slightly tragic about that wisdom. The smarter you get, the more you know what the body cannot recover from. Experience comes with the map of damage. And still he keeps stepping in, which tells you everything. Not because he is clueless, but because he knows exactly what it costs. That is the opposite of most people's motivation speeches. Most are just pretending their knees are immortal. And then one staircase ends the whole career. I think that is why this hits harder than a normal sports injury story. He is not a one-time victim of a freak accident. He is living inside the accumulated bill of the sport. That phrase hurts because it is true. The accumulated bill is brutal, and he still sounds grateful to be in the fight. That gratitude is what makes him compelling. Not naive gratitude either. More like, I know the price and I paid it anyway, which is either heroic or deeply questionable. Probably both, depending on the day. That is the real tension here, right? We admire the discipline, but the damage is not romantic. It never is once you actually hear it up close. The romance is for spectators. The elbow gets the invoice. That line is terrible and perfect. And that is why I keep coming back to the honesty of it. He is not trying to make pain look noble. He is just describing the cost of staying elite, which is somehow more powerful. It makes greatness feel less like magic and more like commitment. And commitment in real life is usually ugly. Finally, an honest slogan for sports. Ugly commitment and broken elbows. That sounds awful, but it is kind of the truth. And maybe that is why these athletes fascinate people. They make visible what everybody else tries to hide. The wear, the fear, the adaptation. The very expensive adaptation. Seriously, the medical industry must love elite sports. I just respect that he never turned it into pity. He gave you the mechanism, not the sob story. That is usually where real credibility lives. In the details people can barely explain. Yeah, and in the willingness to keep showing up anyway. Even when the showing up is painful in ways most people cannot imagine. That is the whole conversation right there. And somehow we only talked about elbows, which is already enough to ruin my day. Mine too, honestly. Bro, weaponized arthritis is such a savage phrase. It sounds like a joke until you realize it's his entire career. And the insane part is he says it almost like a feature. Most people want their elbows to work. This guy is optimizing damage. That's the most elite athlete sentence ever. But that's what separates hobby pain from pro pain. Hobby pain means you complain and stop. Pro pain means you build a system around it. That system is wild, though, because it's not just grit. It's surgery, recovery, technique, and ego management. Ego management might be the hardest surgery of all. Seriously, because most guys would hear rest and take that as disrespect. Especially in a sport where your whole identity is being harder than the other guy. So when he says he was a dummy and kept going, I actually believe him. That is such a clean admission for a guy with surgical elbows. But it's also honest, because greatness usually has some stupidity in it. A little bit of idiocy is practically part of the resume. Yeah, nobody gets legendary by being super reasonable. And then there's that part about the nerves and blood flow getting constricted. That's not just pain, that's your body sending an actual stop sign. Right. That's when it stops being toughen up and becomes real damage. People love turning every injury into a motivational poster. But some stuff is just your body saying the bill is due. And still he keeps framing it like a trade-off he accepts. That level of commitment is kind of unsettling, but also weirdly beautiful, if I'm being honest. Beautiful in a horrifying way, yes. Like a luxury car with the warning lights permanently on. Still doing 140, just screaming internally. I keep thinking about how arm wrestling rewards weird adaptations. Like the limited range actually becomes part of the strategy. Which is hilarious, because in every other sport that sounds terrible. In basketball, it's a disaster. In arm wrestling, it's a weapon. That's the part people miss. The body isn't always broken. Sometimes it's been remodeled for one narrow war. And that war is so specific that even the terminology sounds homemade. Rising, posting, dragging. It sounds like someone's describing a jailbreak. Honestly, it kind of is a jailbreak from bad leverage. He mentioned grip work and technique, and that's the real story. Because people think arm wrestling is just arm strength, which is adorable and completely wrong. It's hand control, tendon angles, shoulder position, timing. It's basically a tiny physics problem with consequences. A tiny physics problem that can ruin your month. That's why I love when elite sports expose how dumb our first impressions are. You think you're watching brute force, but you're really watching engineering. And pain tolerance, which is the ugliest part of engineering. The body keeps receipts, man. Yep, and it never sends them to spam. What got me was how casually he talked about 3 surgeries. 3 surgeries to keep your elbows moving is absurd. And yet he says it like maintenance, not tragedy. That's a different relationship with suffering. It's almost like if you choose the pain, it feels more organized. Exactly, because random pain is fear, chosen pain is investment. Although, let's be honest, sometimes chosen pain is just stubbornness with better branding. Better branding is so real. Every dangerous hobby has a marketing department somewhere. And he did say the good doctor extended his career. That line hit me, because medicine basically became part of his training. Which means the sport is not just competition, it's ongoing body management. Exactly, it's like being both athlete and repair project. Athlete, repair project, and sometimes science experiment. The worst kind of science experiment, because the subject keeps volunteering. Do you think that makes greatness less romantic or more real? More real, definitely. Romance is clean, greatness is usually messy and slightly alarming, and mostly held together by tape, ice, and delusion. Do not forget pride, the strongest adhesive. There's also that thing where the injury becomes identity. Like the scar is not just tolerated, it's almost honored. Yeah, and that can be inspiring or kind of dangerous. Because then everybody starts thinking suffering is proof of commitment, which is how people get wrecked chasing a badge nobody gave them. But for him, it sounds earned, not performative. He didn't sound like he was romanticizing it, just describing the deal. And sometimes that's the scariest version, the non-dramatic one. Yeah, because dramatic people at least know they're being dramatic. The calm ones are already too deep in it. I also liked that he said it doesn't affect him in the sport. Like, how do you say that with a straight face after all that? That's peak competitor delusion, and I respect it. But maybe that's the secret, refusing to let the damage define your ceiling. Or maybe the damage literally created the ceiling and he learned it. That is such a grim way to say mastery. Grim, but probably closer to the truth. That whole world feels like controlled collapse. And the best ones somehow make it look stable. Like a chair with one missing leg that still somehow works. I think what makes it compelling is the honesty about cost. No fake wellness language, no pretending it's all clean. Just bones, scar tissue, and a weird amount of pride. That's the least Instagrammable greatness imaginable, which is exactly why it's interesting. And honestly, I respect the people who keep showing up after the body protests. Not because pain is noble, but because the discipline is. There is something sacred about that kind of repetition. Sacred, but with terrible elbows. That's the headline right there. And probably the whole point, greatness has a body count, just not always the one you expect. Yeah, and the weird part is people still line up for it. Because the chase itself becomes the addiction. Man, that is such a brutal sentence. But it is true, and that's why it lands. I think that's the thing I keep coming back to. He didn't sound broken. He sounded committed in a way most people will never understand. And a little bit stubborn, which helps more than people admit. Stubbornness is basically a premium training supplement. Illegal in most emotionally healthy households. Still, I can't tell if I admire it or fear it. Both is probably the correct answer. Yeah, both.